I killed them. And if I had the chance, I'd do it again. Because in our world, mercy is just another word for weakness.
Those were the words that greeted General George S. Patton in the bitter, freezing spring of 1945. They didn't come from a desperate, broken man begging for his life at the end of a lost war. They came from a high-ranking officer of the elite SS Leibstandarte division, a man who had just been captured by the American 11th Armored Division. He wasn't looking for a lawyer. He wasn't looking for a military tribunal or a fair trial. He was actively looking for a reaction. He wanted to see if the so-called cowardly Americans had the stomach to hear the raw, unfiltered truth about what had happened to their brothers in the blood-soaked snows of Malmedy. He stood there with a smirk on his face, fully expecting the Americans to honor the Geneva Convention, fully expecting to be treated as a gentleman officer, and fully expecting to use their own morality against them. Before we go any further into the dark heart of this story, if you want to see the moments where history stopped being a sanitized, polite textbook and started being a brutal psychological battle for the human soul, hit that subscribe button right now. We don't do boring historical summaries here. We dive into the raw, unfiltered truth of the men who forged our world, the decisions that kept them awake at night, and the exact moments the rules of warfare were completely rewritten in blood and mud. Now put yourself back into that tense interrogation room. General Patton was standing there, his iconic ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the dim light, staring at a man who had just proudly and arrogantly admitted to being a mass murderer of unarmed men. The standard military doctrine of the United States Army dictated a very specific, highly regulated protocol for this exact situation. You are supposed to isolate the prisoner. You are supposed to document the confession in triplicate. You pass that documentation up the chain of command, and you let the military tribunals handle the justice in a quiet courtroom months after the shooting stops. That was the American way. That was the foundational concept that made them the good guys in the greatest conflict in human history. But Patton realized in that microscopic instant that standard doctrine was utterly hopelessly useless. He wasn't dealing with a traditional soldier who had simply fought for the wrong side or followed a bad order. He was dealing with a deeply indoctrinated ideological fanatic. He was dealing with a monster wearing a tailored uniform. And Patton understood a truth that made politicians deeply uncomfortable. You do not fight monsters with paperwork, treaties, and tribunals. You fight them with absolute, unrelenting, and terrifying fire. To understand the sheer gravity of this confrontation, we have to pull back the curtain on the moral oxygen Patton was actively providing his troops. And to do that, you must understand exactly who the enemy was. Up until the devastating winter of 1944, the American GIs had been strictly trained to be professional combatants. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, and kids from Brooklyn who were instructed to follow the Geneva Convention to the absolute letter. If a German soldier dropped his Mauser rifle and raised his hands, the fight was instantly over. You fed him, you patched his bleeding wounds, and you sent him to a prisoner of war camp in the rear where he would safely wait out the rest of the conflict. But the Waffen-SS, specifically units like the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, operated on an entirely different, incredibly dark frequency. These men were originally formed as Hitler's personal bodyguards. They had spent years on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets in a war of absolute annihilation, where no quarter was asked and none was given. They had been systematically brainwashed since their youth in the Hitler Youth programs to view American soldiers not as equals in combat, but as inferior, soft, and undisciplined civilians playing dress-up in military gear. This toxic superiority complex, fueled by desperation and fanaticism, culminated in one of the darkest days in American military history at the Bonnier Crossroads during the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge. It was there that the heavily armored SS Kampfgruppe Piper, led by the ruthless Joachim Piper, intercepted a lightly armed American convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans, hopelessly outgunned, cut off, and surrounded by Tiger tanks, did the only logical thing a soldier can do. They surrendered. They were disarmed, searched, and herded into a freezing, snow-covered field alongside a cafe. Then, on a signal, the SS opened fire with heavy machine guns mounted on their half-tracks, leaving 84 American boys bleeding to death in the snow. Those who survived the initial deafening volley were systematically walked over and shot point-blank in the head by laughing SS troopers. When the horrifying news of the Malmedy Massacre hit the American front lines, the psychological impact was catastrophic and immediate. It wasn't just fear that spread through the freezing foxholes of the Ardennes forest. It was a profound, boiling, and uncontrollable outrage. The entire concept of honorable combat evaporated overnight. The American troops realized they were fighting an enemy that did not recognize their basic humanity, an enemy that viewed their surrender not as a cessation of hostilities, but as an opportunity for target practice. But an army's outrage means absolutely nothing without a commander who is willing to unchain it. That is exactly what General George S. Patton did, and it is why he remains one of the most controversial figures to ever wear the stars of an American general. Patton reportedly told his immediate staff and unit commanders that the SS were no longer classified as soldiers. In his eyes, the exact moment they began executing unarmed men in the snow, they permanently forfeited every single protection granted by the laws of armed conflict. He labeled them animals and barbarians. And then, he made a calculated, cold-blooded decision that still sparks intense, heated debate among military historians and ethicists today. He essentially signaled to his commanders that if the SS wanted to play by a completely barbaric set of rules, the United States Third Army was more than happy to oblige them. He gave his men the ultimate moral oxygen to seek retribution. He stripped the enemy of their protected status. Here is the first question I have for you. If you were a high-ranking commander and the enemy was systematically executing your surrendered men, would you officially strip them of their POW protections? Type the word storm in the comments right now if you believe Patton was absolutely right to unleash his men, or type the word law if you think maintaining the moral high ground is more important than revenge, even in the face of total evil. Let us know exactly where you draw the line. This terrifying directive wasn't a sudden, irrational burst of temper from a hot-headed general. It was the direct, deliberate application of Patton's core philosophy on warfare. Patton had a deep, almost ancient respect for the warrior code. He famously believed in reincarnation, genuinely feeling that he had lived past lives fighting alongside Alexander the Great, marching with the Roman legions, and riding with Napoleon's cavalry. To him, a soldier who fought with honor was a brother, a member of a sacred international fraternity, regardless of what uniform he wore or what flag he flew. He had famously expressed respect for certain commanders of the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, like Erwin Rommel. But a man who murdered the defenseless? That was a fundamental betrayal of combat itself. It was a sin against the warrior's soul. We see the absolute genius of Patton's psychological warfare and his deep-seated hatred for Nazi arrogance most clearly in an earlier, highly documented event, his personal interrogation of SS Major General Anton Dunkern in November 1944. Anton Dunkern was the SS and police leader in the heavily fortified city of Metz. He wasn't just a frontline combat commander. He was a ruthless political enforcer, a man responsible for implementing the darkest, most oppressive policies of the Nazi regime in occupied French territory. He was the Gestapo incarnate. When the advancing Americans finally captured him after a brutal siege, Dunkern expected to be treated as a high-ranking political and military dignitary. He expected the traditional officer-to-officer respect. He expected to sit down with an American equal and discuss the terms of his captivity over a cup of coffee. Here is the crucial, fascinating detail that makes this encounter legendary and shows exactly how Patton's mind worked. General Patton was perfectly fluent in French and had an excellent, highly functional working knowledge of the German language. He understood every single word that Anton Dunkern was saying. He could have easily interrogated the man personally, engaging in a high-stakes intellectual duel in the Nazi general's native tongue to show his dominance. He refused. Patton walked into that interrogation room, stood directly in front of Dunkern, looked the man dead in the eyes with a stare that could cut through steel, and deliberately spoke only through an American military interpreter. Why? Because to Patton, speaking directly to a Nazi war criminal was an honor that the man simply did not deserve. He wanted Dunkern to feel entirely marginalized. He wanted the arrogant SS general to realize that he wasn't even worth the breath of an American commander. Every time Dunkern attempted to justify his horrific actions, every time he tried to explain the strategic necessity of the Nazi occupation, or bragged about his elite status within the hierarchy of the Third Reich. Patton didn't debate him. He didn't argue the politics of the war. He didn't raise his voice to scream or throw a tantrum. He simply looked at the young American interpreter and issued a single, devastating, venomous word. Liar. Tell him he's a liar. Tell him he's a disgrace to the uniform of any army in the history of the world. Tell him he's not a soldier, he's a vile, disgusting political policeman. Imagine the shattered ego of a high-ranking SS general, a man who had held the terrifying power of life and death over thousands of civilians for years, being systematically dismantled and publicly humiliated by an American who wouldn't even acknowledge his voice. It was a masterclass in psychological execution. Patton was surgically stripping away the one thing these fanatics valued above all else: their sense of elite importance and racial superiority. He was showing Duncan that in the grand, sweeping theater of history, he was nothing more than a pathetic, captured criminal waiting for the gallows. This brings us to another critical debate that I want you to weigh in on. Do you think silence and calculated psychological humiliation are more effective weapons against an arrogant enemy than physical punishment? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Would you have engaged him directly to put him in his place? Or would you have used the interpreter to break his fragile ego? But the real bloody reckoning of this ideology happened far away from the quiet, tense interrogation rooms. It happened in the freezing, unforgiving mud of the Ardennes offensive. When Patton's 11th Armored Division pushed deep into places like Chenogne, the moral oxygen he had provided led directly to some of the most controversial and brutal incidents of the entire European theater. Incidents that the United States military tried to bury for decades. After discovering the frozen, mutilated bodies of their fellow Americans at Malmedy, the American troops underwent a massive, irreversible psychological shift. They realized that taking SS prisoners was not only incredibly dangerous, but it felt like a profound betrayal to the men who had been massacred. The unwritten rule of the front line became horrifyingly simple. The SS do not get to surrender. So on New Year's Day, 1945, at the war-torn village of Chenogne, the American GIs stopped playing by the rulebook written in Geneva. During the intense fighting to retake the village, American troops captured roughly 60 German soldiers, a mix of Wehrmacht regulars and SS unit members. Under normal circumstances, these men would have been disarmed, gathered together, and marched to the rear echelons. Instead, the Americans, fueled by the memory of Malmedy and implicitly backed by Patton's "take no prisoners" rhetoric regarding the SS, lined the surrendered Germans up in a frozen field. Without a trial, without a second thought, they opened fire with heavy machine guns and M1 Garands, executing them all on the spot. They responded to the no-quarter policy of the SS with a ruthless, bloody no-quarter policy of their own. When reports of the Chenogne massacre inevitably reached the Allied High Command, it created a massive, panicked crisis. Executing surrendered prisoners was a direct, undeniable violation of the rules of war, the very rules the Allies claimed to be fighting to protect from fascist tyranny. But Patton's reaction, recorded in his own private diaries, reveals the sheer, terrifying complexity of his wartime mindset. He explicitly wrote that he hoped the incident could be concealed. He understood the massive political fallout it would cause back home. But on a fundamental, visceral level, he completely sympathized with the rage of his men. He knew that you cannot ask young, terrified men to witness the brutal slaughter of their best friends and then expect them to act like polite diplomats when they finally capture the killers. This is the deeply uncomfortable gray area of history that textbook summaries and Hollywood movies desperately try to avoid. We want to view World War II as a perfectly clean fight between absolute good and absolute evil, where the good guys always hold the moral high ground. But Patton understood the dark, grinding reality of total war. Against an enemy that utilizes pure terror as a standard tactic, you sometimes have to become vastly more terrifying than they are. He knew that the only currency an ideological fanatic respects is overwhelming, uncompromising, lethal force. He didn't want his men to be polite. He wanted them to be victorious. And he knew that to secure victory against the ideological poison of the SS, you had to completely break their spirit before you broke their defensive lines. Let me ask you directly, and I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. If you were an American GI standing in the freezing snow at Chenogne, your hands numb, your heart racing, having just seen the stiff, bloody bodies of your friends at Malmedy, what would you have done? Would you have pulled the trigger? Or would you have holstered your weapon and escorted those prisoners to the rear? It's incredibly easy to judge from the comfort and safety of the modern world. But put yourself in that freezing, blood-soaked uniform. Tell us your honest reaction below. To truly comprehend why Patton's views on the SS crystallized into pure, unadulterated hatred, you have to look at what happened a few months later, when the Third Army pushed deep into the heart of Germany and uncovered the ultimate horrifying truth of the Nazi machine. In April 1945, advancing American armored forces liberated Ohrdruf, a notorious subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp network. It was the first major Nazi camp liberated by U.S. troops on the Western Front. Patton visited the camp alongside General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley, expecting to see a prisoner of war facility or a forced labor camp. Patton was a man who had spent his entire life studying, obsessing over, and participating in warfare. He had seen men blown apart by artillery in the muddy trenches of World War I. He had seen the carnage of tank battles in North Africa and the bloody beaches of Sicily. He had witnessed more physical trauma and death than almost any human being alive on the planet. But absolutely nothing in his vast military experience could have prepared him for the gates of Ohrdruf. When the generals walked through the barbed wire, they didn't find a military target. They found the absolute end result of the SS ideology. They saw massive pyres of half-burned human bodies stacked like cordwood. They saw the emaciated, starving survivors crawling through the mud. People who looked more like living skeletons than human beings. They smelled the overwhelming, sickening stench of rotting flesh, human waste, and institutionalized, industrialized murder. The historical accounts of that day state that General Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, turned completely pale and remained completely silent, visibly struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the atrocity. General Patton, the ultimate tough guy, the man known globally as Old Blood and Guts, the warrior who thrived on the chaos of battle, walked behind a wooden barracks, leaned against the wall, and physically vomited. He was physically sickened by the profound, unfathomable cowardice of it all. To Patton, war was a violent contest of strength between armed men. What he saw at Ohrdruf wasn't war. It was a slaughterhouse designed by cowards. But Patton didn't just walk away, wash his hands, and write a sterile report to Washington. He turned his deep physical disgust into immediate, unforgiving psychological action. He realized that the German civilian population, many of whom lived in comfortable homes just miles from the camp, continuously claimed they had absolutely no idea what was happening behind the fences. Patton violently refused to let them play the victims of ignorance. He ordered his military police to go directly into the neighboring town of Gotha. They aggressively rounded up the mayor, his wife, and dozens of prominent, wealthy local citizens. Patton forced them, under armed guard, to walk through the camp. He made them look closely at the rotting bodies. He made them smell the death that had been happening in their backyard. He forced them to see exactly what their political complacency, their silence, and their master race ideology had funded and supported. The psychological impact of Patton's ruthless decision was immediate and devastating. The very next day, the mayor of Gotha and his wife were found dead in their home. They had hanged themselves. They could not live with the crushing guilt and the horrifying reality of what Patton forced them to witness with their own eyes. It was after the horrors of Ohrdruf that Patton's resolve to fight fire with fire became an immovable, unshakable doctrine. He realized with absolute clarity that the war in Europe wasn't just a geopolitical struggle over borders, resources, or political systems. It was an existential battle for the soul of humanity, a fight to determine if the future of the human race was going to be dictated by civilized laws or by barbaric, genocidal monsters. And in Patton's rigid worldview, there is only one acceptable way to deal with a monster. You hunt it down relentlessly. You strip it of its dignity, you deny it any mercy, and you destroy it completely. This is exactly why General George S. Patton remains one of the most polarizing, debated, and fascinating figures in modern military history. He did not care a single bit about political optics. He did not care about public relations or how his actions would play in the newspapers back home. He cared deeply about the survival of the American GI, and he cared about the integrity of the warrior's code. When he stripped the SS of their status and allowed his men to bypass the rules of war, he wasn't just acting out of blind vengeance. He was establishing a harsh, unforgiving standard of justice. He was declaring that the title of soldier is a sacred designation, earned through honorable conduct on the battlefield. And the exact moment you spit on that code by slaughtering the defenseless, you lose the fundamental right to live under its protection. He understood that you cannot negotiate with a mindset that views mercy as a weakness. You cannot sign treaties with men who execute prisoners in the snow. You can only crush them until they are incapable of ever standing up again. Here is the final question for our community, and it is the most important one. Do you think the modern world is too soft to produce a leader like Patton today? In an era of constant political correctness, endless diplomatic maneuvering, and micromanaged rules of engagement, is there still a place for a battlefield commander who is willing to be exactly as dangerous, ruthless, and unyielding as the enemy? Type your deeply held thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and this is a historical conversation that absolutely needs to happen right now. We continue to study Patton not because he was a perfect man. He was a deeply flawed human being who made massive strategic and political mistakes, frequently offended his own allies, struck his own soldiers, and ultimately destroyed his own career in the aftermath of the war. But we remember him, and we revere his memory. Because when the darkest, most terrifying ideology the world had ever seen threatened to consume the entire continent of Europe, he was the only man who had the sheer, unadulterated courage to step into the mud and fight the devil on his own terms. He didn't wait for permission from politicians to be a hero. He didn't ask for a committee to approve his tactics. He saw absolute evil looking him in the eye, and he used every ounce of his intellect, his boiling rage, and his massive military power to eradicate it from the earth. Thank you for sticking with us through this massive, intense deep dive into the heart and mind of General Patton and the men of the Third Army. These stories aren't just dry historical footnotes meant to be memorized for a test. They are the very blueprints of the character, courage, and resilience we desperately need in the modern world. If you believe that true honor is still worth fighting for, if you believe that history should be told without censorship, hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and share this video with someone who appreciates real, unfiltered history. Your support is the only thing that allows us to keep digging through the forgotten archives to bring these incredible legends back to life. We have a lot more intense, deeply human stories from the front lines of history coming your way, and we don't want you to miss a single second of the action. Stay curious, stay proud, and remember the lesson of the Third Army. Never let anyone use your honor against you, and never show mercy to those who view it as a weakness. We will see you in the next video. Stay strong.